The notification pinged on my phone at 11:47 p.m., just as I was considering calling it a night. One more ride, I told myself, same as I'd been telling myself for the past 3 years since Martha died and left me with nothing but medical bills and this beat-up Honda Civic that doubled as my office, my sanctuary, and sometimes my prison. Michael requesting pickup at Meridian Tower, the app announced in that artificially cheerful voice that had become the soundtrack to my existence. Meridian Tower? That glass monument to excess downtown where parking spots cost more than most people's rent. I'd picked up plenty of entitled trust fund kids from that building, watched them slide into my back seat like they were doing me a favor just by breathing my air. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the city streets into rivers of neon light. My windshield wipers groaned with each pass, a rhythmic complaint that matched my mood. 63 years old and driving strangers around at midnight? This wasn't how I'd pictured my golden years. But life has a way of rewriting your story when you're not paying attention. I pulled up to the tower's gleaming entrance, where a doorman in a uniform that probably cost more than my monthly insurance payment stood under an awning big enough to shelter half the homeless population. The rain drummed against my roof like impatient fingers, and I could feel the dampness seeping through my jacket. My arthritis was acting up again, a constant reminder of all the construction jobs that had slowly destroyed my joints over 4 decades. The passenger door opened, and immediately I was hit with the smell of expensive cologne and wet wool. A young man slid in, maybe late 20s, wearing a suit that screamed money even in the dim light of my car. His hair was perfectly styled despite the rain, and when he pulled out his phone, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a Rolex catching the streetlight. "Airport," he said without looking up from his screen, his voice carrying that particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having to ask for anything twice. "Terminal 3. And keep it smooth, I've got calls to make." I adjusted my rearview mirror and caught his eye for just a second. There was something familiar about his face, something that tugged at a memory I couldn't quite place. But in this business, you'll learn not to stare too long. Rich passengers don't like being studied by the help. "Sure thing," I said, pulling away from the curb and into the late-night traffic. The radio was playing some soft rock station that helped fill the silence, but I kept the volume low. You never knew what these passengers might say, and sometimes their conversations were more entertaining than anything on the radio. He was on his phone before we'd gone 3 blocks, speaking in that loud, self-important way that suggested he wanted to be overheard. I'd driven enough corporate types to recognize the performance. Every phone call was a chance to impress whoever might be listening, even if it was just the driver. "Yeah, Mom, I told you not to worry about it," he was saying, his tone condescending in a way that made my jaw tighten. "The inheritance is already in motion. $33 million, just like Grandfather promised. I'll have access to it by Friday." My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. 33 million. Christ, what I could do with even a fraction of that money. Pay off the house, maybe take a vacation somewhere warm for my aching joints, stop driving drunk college kids around at 2 in the morning. "No, I'm not going to be responsible with it," he continued, making air quotes that I could see in my peripheral vision. "I'm 28 years old. I think I can handle my own finances without advice from someone who's been living off Dad's guilt money for the past decade." The venom in his voice when he mentioned his father made something cold settle in my stomach. I'd heard plenty of family drama in my back seat over the years, but there was something particularly ugly about the way this kid talked about his parents. Like they were obstacles to be overcome rather than people who'd raised him. "Look, I don't care what he thinks," the passenger went on, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "He chose to leave us when I was 15. He doesn't get an opinion on how I spend my inheritance now. Besides, he's probably broke anyway. Last I heard, he was working some blue-collar job like a common laborer. The words hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly I knew why his face had seemed familiar. The shape of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, even the sound of his laugh. It was like looking at myself 30 years ago, before life had worn me down to the bone. Michael, my son Michael, who I hadn't seen since he was 16 and told me he never wanted to speak to me again. The boy who'd screamed that I was a failure and an embarrassment, that he was ashamed to share my last name. The kid who'd chosen his mother's new husband over the man who'd worked 16-hour days just to keep food on the table. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I kept my eyes on the road and my mouth shut. This was impossible. Michael didn't even know I drove for Uber. Hell, Michael didn't know anything about my life for the past 12 years. We'd been strangers by his choice, and I'd respected that decision even though it had nearly killed me. The best part is, he continued, completely oblivious to the fact that his estranged father was listening to every word. I'm going to buy that penthouse on Fifth Avenue, the one with the view of the park. Can you imagine? Me living like a king while my loser father probably shares a studio apartment with 3 roommates. He laughed at his own joke, and the sound made my blood boil. Not because of what he'd said about me, I'd heard worse from strangers, but because of the casual cruelty in his voice. This wasn't the sweet, curious boy I'd pushed on swings and taught to ride a bike. This was someone I didn't recognize, someone who'd been shaped by money and privilege into something cold and calculating. "Yeah, Mom, I know you think I should reach out to him," Michael said, his tone softening slightly. "But what's the point? It's been over a decade. He made his choice when he decided work was more important than family. Now I'm making mine." I wanted to slam on the brakes, turn around, and tell him exactly what his choice had cost me. How many nights I'd lain awake, wondering if I'd failed him as a father. How many times I'd driven past his school or his mother's house, just hoping for a glimpse of him growing up. How his grandfather's money, my own father's money, was supposed to be split between all of us, not just handed over to one spoiled kid who thought the world owed him everything. But I kept driving, kept listening, kept my mouth shut like the professional I'd learned to be. Because sometimes the best revenge is letting people bury themselves with their own words. And Michael was digging his grave deeper with every sentence. "Trust me," he said, ending his call and settling back into the leather seat I'd had reupholstered twice just to keep this old car looking decent. "By this time next week, I'll be set for life. No more worrying about money, no more dealing with people who don't understand what I'm capable of. Just me, my inheritance, and all the time in the world to enjoy it." He put his phone away and finally seemed to notice his surroundings, glancing out the window at the city passing by. We were about halfway to the airport now, stuck in the kind of traffic that only existed in this metropolitan nightmare, surrounded by other drivers who were probably just as tired and broke and desperate as I was. "You ever wonder what it would be like?" he asked suddenly, and for a moment I thought he was talking to someone else. But when I checked the mirror, his eyes were focused on the back of my head. "Having more money than you know what to do with?" The question hung in the air between us like a loaded gun, and I realized this was my moment. I could tell him who I was, could watch his face crumble as he realized he'd just spent the last 20 minutes insulting his father to his face. I could make him squirm, make him apologize, make him feel as small and worthless as his words had made me feel. Instead, I cleared my throat and said, "I imagine it would be nice not to worry about paying bills." He laughed, that same cruel sound that had been cutting through me for the past few minutes. "Bills," he repeated, like the word itself was amusing. Yeah, I guess that's what poor people worry about: bills and rent and whether they can afford to eat out once a month. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel now, and I could feel a vein pulsing in my temple. This kid, my kid, had no idea what struggle looked like. He'd never worked a double shift because the rent was due, never chosen between groceries and medication, never felt the crushing weight of knowing you disappointed the people who depended on you. Must be nice to have that kind of security, I managed to say, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. It will be, Michael said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. 3 days from now, I'll never have to think about money again. I'll never have to depend on anyone or worry about impressing people who don't matter. I'll be completely free. Free. The word echoed in my head as we finally pulled into the airport terminal. From what? From responsibility? From consequences? From the memory of a father who loved him more than life itself, but hadn't known how to show it in a way that mattered? I pulled up to the departure curb and put the car in park, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the door handle. Michael was already gathering his things, checking his phone one more time before stepping out into the night. "Thanks for the ride," he said, handing me a $20 tip that probably meant less to him than the loose change in my cup holder meant to me. "And hey, maybe someday you'll get lucky too. Maybe someday you'll catch a break." He slammed the door and disappeared into the terminal, leaving me alone with the rain and the radio and the echo of his voice saying words I'd never forget. Maybe someday you'll catch a break. As if luck was the only thing standing between me and the kind of success he'd been handed on a silver platter. I sat there for a long time after he was gone, watching other drivers pick up passengers and drop them off, the endless cycle of service that had become my life. The rain kept falling, and my arthritis kept aching, and somewhere inside that terminal, my son was probably boarding a plane to God knows where, carrying $33 million that should have been split between us according to my father's original will. But Michael didn't know about that will, did he? He didn't know about the codicils and amendments, about the trust funds and contingencies that my father had put in place to protect his money from exactly the kind of person Michael had become. He didn't know that the inheritance he was so sure about was conditional, or that there were other beneficiaries who had to be notified before any money could change hands. Most importantly, he didn't know that his grandfather's will specifically stated that any heir who made no effort to contact or reconcile with estranged family members would forfeit their claim to the estate. As I pulled away from the terminal and headed back into the city, I found myself smiling for the first time in months. Maybe Michael was right about one thing. Maybe someday I would catch a break. Maybe that someday was closer than either of us had imagined. The notification on my phone pinged again. Another ride request, another stranger with another story. But for once, I wasn't just Dave the Uber driver, invisible and forgotten. For once, I was a man with knowledge, with power, with the ability to change someone's life with a single phone call. 3 days, Michael had said. 3 days until he expected to be set for life. Well, I thought as I accepted the next ride, sometimes expectations and reality don't quite line up the way we hope they will. And sometimes the people we dismiss as irrelevant turn out to be the most important players in the game. The rain was still falling, but it didn't seem quite as cold anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. How could I? After 12 years of silence, 12 years of wondering what had become of the boy I'd raised, 12 years of carrying the guilt and shame of a marriage that had fallen apart despite my best efforts. After all of that, my son had literally fallen into my lap, speaking words that would change both our lives forever. By morning, I'd made 3 phone calls that Michael didn't know about. The first was to Harrison Kowalski and Associates, the law firm that had handled my father's estate. My dad had been a complicated man, a construction foreman who'd built a small empire through smart real estate investments and careful savings, but who'd never been comfortable with the wealth he'd accumulated. The lawyer, Janet Harrison, remembered me, even though we'd only met twice, once when Dad died 5 years ago, and once when I'd turned down my immediate inheritance, asking that it be held in trust until Michael and I could reconcile. The notification on my phone pinged again. Another ride request, another stranger with another story. But for once, I wasn't just Dave the Uber driver, invisible and forgotten. For once, I was a man with knowledge, with power, with the ability to change someone's life with a single phone call. 3 days, Michael had said. 3 days until he expected to be set for life. Well, I thought as I accepted the next ride, sometimes expectations and reality don't quite line up the way we hope they will. And sometimes the people we dismiss as irrelevant turn out to be the most important players in the game. The rain was still falling, but it didn't seem quite as cold anymore. "David," she said when I called, her voice professionally warm but cautious, "I was wondering when you'd contact us. Your son's been calling here every day for the past week, asking about when he can access the funds." "What have you told him?" "Exactly what the will stipulates, that all beneficiaries must be present or accounted for before any distribution can occur. He seems to think he's the sole heir." I'd laughed bitterly at that. His mother probably told him that. She never understood the conditions Dad put in place. "Have you made any attempt to contact him directly?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Or in this case, the $33 million question. We had contact last night. He doesn't know it was me, but we spoke. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "David, you know what the will says. If there's no good faith effort at reconciliation, if family members actively avoid each other or refuse to communicate, the inheritance gets donated to charity, I remember. All of it, the entire estate goes to the American Heart Association, just like your father wanted, if his family couldn't get along after he was gone." My father, the old bastard, even in death trying to force us all to play nice. It would have been funny if it weren't so perfectly like him, using his money as leverage to try to fix relationships that had been broken long before he drew up his will. The second call was to Michael's mother, Rebecca. That conversation was harder than talking to the lawyer, harder than admitting to a stranger that I'd been driving an Uber and had accidentally picked up my own son. Rebecca had remarried within 2 years of our divorce, had moved Michael into a world of country clubs and private schools that I could never have afforded on a construction worker's salary. "Dave?" Her voice carried the same mixture of surprise and wariness it always had when I called. "It's been months since. Is everything all right? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. What have you told Michael about his grandfather's inheritance?" The silence stretched long enough that I almost thought she'd hung up. "Dave, Rebecca, what did you tell him?" "I told him what I thought was true, that he was getting the money when he turned 28. His birthday was last week. But you never told him about the conditions, about the reconciliation clause." Another pause. "I hoped, maybe by now you two would have worked things out on your own. I never imagined it would go this long without either of you reaching out." "He thinks I'm a failure, Rebecca. He thinks I chose work over family. And maybe he's right. But he also thinks he's getting $33 million in 3 days. And is planning to spend it on penthouses and God knows what else." "Dave, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I saw him last night. He got into my Uber, not knowing who I was, and spent 20 minutes telling me exactly what kind of person he's become. And it's not someone Dad would have wanted to inherit that money." I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, processing what I was telling her. "You're not going to let him lose the inheritance. Please tell me you're not that cruel." Cruel? The word hit me harder than I'd expected. Was it cruel to let Michael face the consequences of his own choices? Was it cruel to enforce the conditions that my father had put in place specifically to prevent this kind of situation? I'm going to do exactly what Dad's will requires, I said finally. I'm going to make a good faith effort at reconciliation. What Michael does with that effort is up to him. The third call was the hardest one to make, but also the most necessary. I called Michael's phone directly, using the number Rebecca had given me years ago, the number I'd never had the courage to dial. It went straight to voicemail, which wasn't surprising. He was probably on a plane somewhere, or maybe he'd already blocked my number years ago and never bothered to tell anyone. I left a message anyway, short and to the point. Michael, this is your father. I know we haven't spoken in 12 years, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me. But there are some things about your grandfather's will that you need to know, things that affect both of us. I'll be at Mel's Diner on 5th Street tomorrow at noon, the same place I used to take you for pancakes when you were 8. If you want to know about your inheritance, the real terms of your inheritance, I'll be there. I hung up before I could second-guess myself, before I could delete the message and pretend this had never happened. The ball was in his court now. I'd done what the will required. I'd made the effort. Whether he showed up or not would determine both our futures. The rest of the day passed in a blur of regular rides. I picked up a businessman going to a meeting, a college student heading to her job at a coffee shop, an elderly woman visiting her husband in the hospital. Normal people with normal problems, people who reminded me that the world was full of struggles much bigger than the drama playing out in my own family. But I couldn't stop thinking about Michael's face in my rearview mirror, couldn't stop hearing the contempt in his voice when he talked about his loser father. 12 years ago, when he'd chosen to go live with his mother full-time, I'd told myself it was better for him. He'd have stability, opportunities, a chance at the kind of life I could never provide. Now, I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. If instead of giving him opportunities, I'd given him license to become someone I didn't recognize. That night, I sat in my small apartment, not a studio shared with 3 roommates, but not much bigger, and looked at the only photo I had of Michael and me together. He was maybe 10 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a fish we'd caught during one of our weekend trips to the lake. I'd kept that photo on my nightstand for 12 years, a reminder of who he used to be, who we used to be together. Tomorrow, I'd find out if that boy still existed somewhere inside the man who'd sat in my back seat talking about penthouse apartments and calling his father a failure. Tomorrow, I'd learn whether 12 years of silence could be broken with pancakes and the truth about $33 million. The notification on my phone pinged, another ride request, but for once I ignored it. Some nights, even Uber drivers get to go home early. Some nights, you need to prepare for conversations that might change everything. I turned off the phone, made myself a cup of coffee, and settled in to wait for morning, wondering if my son would show up to meet a father he thought he'd left behind forever. Wondering if either of us was ready for what came next. Outside my window, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy, millions of people living their own stories of family and loss, hope and disappointment. But for once, I wasn't thinking about other people's problems. For once, I was thinking about my own. Mel's Diner hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same red vinyl booths, the same checkered floor tiles, the same smell of bacon grease and coffee that had made it feel like a second home when Michael was growing up. I'd been coming here since he was 6 years old, back when Sunday morning pancakes were our tradition, back when he'd climb into the booth across from me and tell me everything about his week in that rapid-fire way kids have when they're excited to share their world. I got there at 11:30, ordered coffee, and chose the booth by the window where we used to sit. The waitress, an older woman named Dolores who'd been working there since before Michael was born, recognized me immediately. "Haven't seen you in a while, honey," she said, filling my cup with coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. You waiting for someone? Maybe, I said, checking my phone for the 100th time. No messages, no missed calls, no sign that Michael had even listened to my voicemail. Well, see. The minutes crawled by like hours. 11:45, 11:50, 11:55. I watched every car that pulled into the parking lot, every person who walked through the door, hoping to see my son's face and terrified of what I'd find in his expression when he saw mine. At exactly noon, the bell above the door chimed, and Michael walked in. He looked different in daylight, younger somehow, and I could see more of the boy I remembered in his face, but he also looked tired, stressed, like someone who'd spent a sleepless night trying to figure out why his estranged father was suddenly calling about inheritance details that should have been straightforward. He spotted me immediately. I was probably the only person in the diner old enough to be his father, and for a moment, we just stared at each other across 20 feet of checkered linoleum. Then he walked over, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor, and slid into the booth across from me. "You look older," he said without preamble, his voice carefully neutral. 12 years will do that to a person. So will driving Uber at your age. The words were meant to sting, and they did, but there was something else in his voice now, uncertainty, maybe even embarrassment. He knew he'd been caught, knew that someone had overheard his performance in my back seat, even if he didn't fully understand the implications yet. "How did you know?" I asked. "I didn't, not until this morning when I really looked at the driver's license photo on the app. Then it all clicked." He leaned back in the booth, studying me with eyes that were so much like my own, it hurt to look at them. 12 years of silence, and we end up in your car by accident. What are the odds? Probably better than you think. This city's smaller than people realize, especially when you're driving around it every night. Dolores appeared with a menu for Michael, but he waved her away. "Just coffee," he said, then looked at me. "I assume this isn't a social call." "No, it's not." I pulled out a folded piece of paper, a copy of the relevant sections of my father's will that Janet Harrison had faxed to me that morning. "This is what you need to know about your inheritance." He took the paper, and I watched his face change as he read. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked like panic. This can't be right," he said, looking up at me. "Mom said..." "Your mother said what she thought was true based on incomplete information. She never saw the final version of the will, never knew about the conditions your grandfather added in the last months before he died." Michael read the document again, his lips moving silently as he processed the legal language. "It says here that all beneficiaries must make a good faith effort at reconciliation before any funds can be distributed. What does that mean exactly?" "It means that your grandfather knew this family had a tendency to fall apart, and he didn't want his money going to people who couldn't even be in the same room together, so he made sure that wouldn't happen." "But we're here now. We're talking. Doesn't that count?" I took a sip of my coffee, buying time to choose my words carefully. The will specifies a minimum period of reconciliation, 30 days of regular contact, family counseling if necessary, and evidence that both parties are making a genuine effort to repair their relationship. The color drained from Michael's face. 30 days? But I have contracts in place, deposits on apartments, investments lined up. I told people I'd have the money by Friday. Then you told people the wrong thing. He stared at me across the table, and for the first time since he'd walked into the diner, he looked like the child I remembered, scared, confused, realizing that the world wasn't going to arrange itself around his expectations the way it always had before. "This is your revenge, isn't it?" he said quietly. "You're punishing me for choosing Mom, for not wanting to see you after the divorce." The accusation hit harder than I'd expected, maybe because there was a grain of truth in it. Part of me did want him to suffer, did want him to understand what it felt like to lose something precious through circumstances beyond your control. But that wasn't why we were here. "Michael, I could have told you who I was last night when you were sitting in my car. I could have made you feel small and embarrassed and ashamed. Instead, I came here to tell you the truth and give you a choice." "What choice?" "You can walk away right now. Forget about the inheritance, forget about me, go back to your life and never look back. The money will go to charity, just like your grandfather wanted if his family couldn't get along. Or you can spend the next 30 days getting to know your father again, really getting to know me, not the version of me you've been carrying around in your head for 12 years. We follow the terms of the will, we work with a counselor, and at the end of 30 days, if we've both made a genuine effort, the inheritance gets distributed according to the original terms." Michael was quiet for a long time, staring down at his coffee cup like it might contain the answers to all his problems. Finally, he looked up at me. "How much of the inheritance do you get?" "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." I pulled out another piece of paper, this one showing the distribution schedule. 60% to you as the primary heir, 40% to me as the surviving son, but only if we can prove we're a family again. He studied the numbers, and I could almost see him doing the math in his head. Even 60% of $33 million was more money than most people could spend in a lifetime. But 40% meant I'd be getting over $13 million, enough to change my life as dramatically as his would be changed. "You've been driving Uber for 3 years," he said slowly. "You've been struggling, probably barely making ends meet, and you could have told me all this last night, could have forced me into this situation without giving me any choice at all." "Yes. Why didn't you?" It was the question I'd been asking myself all morning, and I still wasn't sure I had a good answer. Because I wanted you to have a choice. Because even if you've spent 12 years thinking I was a failure and a disappointment, I didn't want to prove you right by manipulating you into a relationship you didn't want. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what the funny thing is? Last night I was so sure I had everything figured out. I was going to be rich, independent, free from all the messy complications of family drama. I was going to live in a penthouse and travel the world and never have to think about this." He gestured between us, encompassing 12 years of silence and hurt and misunderstanding. "What about now?" "Now I'm realizing that maybe independence isn't worth $13 million if it means staying alone forever." He met my eyes across the table. "I said some terrible things about you last night. Things I've been saying for years, actually. You were 15 when your mother and I got divorced. 15-year-olds say terrible things when their world gets turned upside down. I was also 25 when you sent me a birthday card and I threw it away without opening it. And 26 when you tried to call and I blocked your number. And 27 when Mom suggested I reach out to you and I told her I'd rather die first." The words hung between us like a confession, and I could see how much it cost him to say them. "Michael, no, let me finish. I've spent 13 years being angry at you for leaving, for choosing work over family, for not fighting harder to stay in my life. But sitting in your car last night, talking about my inheritance like I deserved it just for existing, I realized I've become exactly the kind of person you probably wouldn't want as a son." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the arrogant young man from my back seat, wasn't the child who'd screamed that he hated me and never wanted to see me again. This was someone else entirely, someone who'd spent a long night confronting some uncomfortable truths about himself. "So, what do you want to do?" I asked. He was quiet for another long moment, then looked up at me with an expression I recognized from when he was small and trying to make a difficult decision. I want to try. I want to spend 30 days getting to know who you really are, not who I've convinced myself you are. And I want you to get to know who I am now, not who I was when I was angry and 15 and didn't understand why my parents couldn't stay together. Even if it means 30 days of therapy sessions and awkward conversations and dealing with all the things we've both been avoiding for over a decade? Especially if it means that. He reached across the table and extended his hand to me. "Hi, Dad. I'm Michael, and I'm really sorry it took $33 million to get me to call you back." I shook his hand, and for the first time in 12 years, I felt like maybe I had a son again. "Hi, Michael. I'm Dave, and I drive Uber because I like meeting new people. Sometimes you pick up passengers who change your whole life." Dolores appeared with the coffee pot, probably sensing that whatever drama had been playing out in our booth was reaching some kind of resolution. "You boys ready for some food? The pancakes are still the best in the city." Michael looked at me, and I saw something in his face that had been missing for too many years. Hope, mixed with nervousness, mixed with the tentative beginnings of forgiveness. "2 stacks of pancakes," I told Dolores. "Extra butter, extra syrup. Just like old times." "Just like old times," Michael agreed, and for the first time since he'd walked into the diner, he smiled. It wasn't gonna be easy. 30 days of rebuilding a relationship that had been broken for over a decade. 30 days of learning to trust each other again. 30 days of family therapy and difficult conversations and all the messy work of forgiveness. But sitting there in that booth, watching my son try to figure out how to talk to his father again, I realized something important. The money had never been the real inheritance. The real inheritance was the chance to be a family again, and that was worth more than any amount my father could have left us. Even if it did come with a $33 million bonus attached. The family counselor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had an office that looked like it had been designed specifically to make people feel safe enough to cry. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs arranged in a circle rather than the traditional couch and desk setup, and enough tissue strategically placed around the room to handle any emotional breakdown that might occur. It was our 3rd session, and Michael and I were still circling each other like boxers in the early rounds, both of us trying to figure out the rules of this new relationship we were attempting to build. "Last week, we talked about the patterns that led to your estrangement," Dr. Martinez said, consulting her notes. "David, you mentioned feeling like you failed as a father because you couldn't provide the kind of lifestyle that Michael's stepfather could offer. And Michael, you talked about feeling abandoned when your father didn't fight harder for custody or visitation. Today, I'd like to explore how those feelings shaped your individual choices over the past 12 years. I shifted in my chair, still uncomfortable with the idea of paying someone to referee conversations between my son and me. But the will had been specific about professional counseling, and Dr. Martinez came highly recommended. More importantly, she seemed to understand that our situation was complicated by financial pressures that most families didn't have to navigate. "I've been thinking about what you said last session," Michael began, looking at me rather than the therapist. "About how you took extra construction jobs to pay for my school clothes and sports equipment. I remember being embarrassed that you'd show up to my games still wearing your work boots, covered in dust or paint or whatever you'd been working with that day. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I'd tried so hard to make it to his baseball games, his school plays, his parent-teacher conferences. Sometimes I'd have to leave a job site early, losing half a day's pay just to sit in those bleachers and watch him play. And all he'd seen was the embarrassment of having a father who looked like he belonged on a construction crew rather than in the stands with the other parents. I didn't understand then that you were sacrificing your own time and money to be there," he continued. "I just knew that Jimmy's dad wore suits to games and yours wore work boots, And somehow that made me feel like less. You were never less, I said, the words coming out rougher than I'd intended. You were everything to me, Michael. Everything I worked for, everything I was proud of. If I could have shown up in a three-piece suit, I would have, but the suit wouldn't have paid for your baseball cleats. Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. Michael, how does it feel to hear your father say that now? It makes me feel like an ass, he said bluntly. It makes me realize that I spent 13 years resenting him for things that weren't his fault, things that were actually him trying to be a good father with limited resources. Dr. Martinez nodded. That's a significant realization. David, how do you respond to hearing that? I was quiet for a moment, processing not just his words, but the tone in which he'd said them. There was genuine remorse there, genuine understanding. It helps, I said finally, but I also need you to know that I made mistakes too. I was so focused on providing for you financially that I probably didn't spend enough time just being with you. I thought working extra hours to pay for things was the same as being a good father, but maybe what you needed was for me to come home earlier and help with homework or just talk about your day. Maybe we both made mistakes, Michael said quietly. Maybe that's why Grandpa put those conditions in his will. Maybe he knew that money problems had torn our family apart, and he didn't want his money to keep us apart forever. It was the most insightful thing either of us had said in 3 weeks of therapy, and I could see Dr. Martinez making a note about it. She'd been pushing us to find common ground, to move past blame and toward understanding, and for the first time, it felt like we were actually getting somewhere. I want to ask you both something, she said. Forget about the inheritance for a moment. Forget about the 30-day requirement and the legal obligations. If there was no money involved at all, would you still want to rebuild this relationship? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized it was the one thing we hadn't directly addressed. Were we here because we genuinely wanted to be father and son again? Or were we just going through the motions to satisfy the terms of a will? Yes, I said without hesitation. The money is life-changing. I won't lie about that. But sitting in that diner with you last week, talking about pancakes and remembering what it felt like to be your dad, that was worth more than any inheritance. Michael was quiet longer, and I could see him wrestling with his own honesty. I don't know, he said finally. I want to say yes, but I'm not sure I would have made the effort without the money as motivation. Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you honest, Dr. Martinez said, and honesty is essential if this relationship is going to work. Michael, what do you think you need from your father to feel confident about saying yes to that question? Time, he said immediately. Real time, not just these scheduled sessions or formal dinners where we're both trying to prove how much progress we're making. I want to see who he really is when he's not trying to impress me or make up for lost time. That afternoon, after our session ended, I made a decision that probably wasn't financially smart, but felt emotionally necessary. You want to see who I really am? I asked Michael as we stood in the parking lot outside Dr. Martinez's office. Come work with me tonight. Work with you? Drive with me. See what my life has actually been like for the past 3 years. No therapy, no formal reconciliation process, just you and me and whatever passengers happen to need a ride. He looked down at his expensive suit, then back at my 12-year-old Honda Civic with its Uber stickers and slightly cracked windshield. I don't have the right clothes for... You can borrow something of mine. We're about the same size now. An hour later, Michael was sitting in my passenger seat wearing an old flannel shirt and jeans I'd bought at Walmart, looking uncomfortable but game for whatever the evening might bring. I'd set the app to accept rides, and we were heading toward the University District where Thursday nights usually meant plenty of business. So, this is what you do, he said, looking around the car's interior. Every night? Most nights. Sometimes. I take weekends off if I'm ahead on bills. but usually I'm out here from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m., sometimes later if it's busy. The first ping came from a downtown hotel, a businessman who needed to get to the airport for an early morning flight. He slid into the back seat, talking loudly on his phone about quarterly projections and market penetration strategies, completely oblivious to the fact that his driver and the man in the passenger seat were in the middle of rebuilding a relationship that had been broken for over a decade. "This is what I was talking about," I said quietly to Michael as we sat in airport traffic. "You hear everything. People treat you like you're invisible, like you're just part of the car. You learn things about strangers that their own families probably don't know. Is that why you like it?" I thought about that for a moment. I like it because every ride is different. Every person has a story. And sometimes those stories remind you that your own problems aren't the only ones in the world. Sometimes they remind you that you're lucky, even when you don't feel lucky. Our second passenger was a college student going home to her parents for the weekend, nervous about telling them she was changing her major from pre-med to art history. She spent the entire 20-minute drive practicing what she was going to say, asking for our opinions on whether her parents would be more upset about the career change or the wasted tuition money. "Tell them you're passionate about it," Michael found himself saying. "Tell them you'd rather be happy doing something you love than miserable doing something that pays well." After she got out, carrying her overnight bag and a portfolio of sketches, Michael turned to me. "Do you think she'll actually tell them?" "I think she'll try." Sometimes it takes sitting in a stranger's car, practicing with people who don't know your history, to figure out how to have difficult conversations with the people who matter most. The third ride was an elderly man going to visit his wife in a memory care facility. He made this trip 3 times a week, he told us, even though she rarely recognized him anymore. But sometimes she'd have good days, days when she'd remember their first dance or their honeymoon or the way he used to make her laugh, and those moments made all the confused, difficult ones worthwhile. 47 years of marriage, he said as we pulled up to the facility. "People ask me why I keep coming when she doesn't even know who I am most of the time. But love isn't just about being recognized or appreciated. Sometimes love is just about showing up, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't seem to matter." After he walked away, carrying a bouquet of flowers that his wife probably wouldn't remember receiving, Michael and I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes without talking. "Is that what you did?" he asked finally. "All those years when I wouldn't take your calls or answer your letters, were you just showing up anyway?" "I was trying to. Maybe not in the right way. Maybe not in a way you could see. But I was trying to stay present in your life, even when you didn't want me there." "I threw away your birthday cards without opening them." "I know. Your mother told me." "I blocked your phone number." "I figured that out when my calls started going straight to voicemail." "And you kept sending them anyway, the cards, I mean." "Until last year, yeah. Last year I stopped because I thought maybe it was time to respect your decision and leave you alone." He turned to look at me, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "What if I hadn't gotten into your car that night? What if this accident hadn't happened? Would we have just gone the rest of our lives never speaking to each other?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe. Or maybe something else would have brought us back together eventually. Sometimes I think the universe has a way of fixing things that are broken, even when the people involved are too stubborn to fix them themselves." The rest of the night passed in a blur of rides. A young couple fighting about money and responsibility, a group of friends celebrating a promotion, a single mother working 2 jobs who fell asleep in the back seat during the 15-minute ride from her day job to her night job. Each passenger brought their own story, their own struggles, their own small victories and defeats. "This is what you see every night?" Michael asked as we dropped off our last passenger, a hospital worker ending a 12-hour shift. "This is what I see. People just trying to get through their days, trying to take care of their families, trying to make ends meet or find happiness, or survive whatever life has thrown at them. It puts things in perspective. What kind of perspective? I pulled into a late-night diner, not Mel's, but a similar place that stayed open for night shift workers and insomniacs and people like us who needed somewhere to sit and talk after a long evening of listening to other people's stories. The perspective that everyone is struggling with something, I said as we settled into a booth with coffee and pie that probably wasn't good for either of us. The businessman worried about his quarterly projections, the college student afraid to disappoint her parents, the old man whose wife doesn't remember him anymore. Everyone is carrying weight that other people can't see, including us. Including us. 12 years of anger and disappointment and missed opportunities to connect. But also 12 years of learning who we are as individuals, 12 years of growing up and figuring out what really matters. Michael was quiet for a long time, stirring sugar into his coffee and watching the other late-night diners around us. I keep thinking about what that old man said, about love being about showing up, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't seem to matter. What about it? I think I understand now why Grandpa put those conditions in his will. It wasn't really about the money, was it? It was about making sure we learned how to show up for each other. I felt something shift inside my chest, a loosening of tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Maybe it was. I want to show up, he said, looking across the table at me with an expression that reminded me so much of the little boy who used to ask me to read him one more bedtime story, just one more. Not just for the next 23 days until the inheritance gets distributed. I want to show up for real, for the long term. I want to learn how to be your son again. I want to learn how to be your father again, too. We finished our coffee and pie, talking about small things, his job at a marketing firm, my regulars who always requested me as their driver, the apartment he was thinking about renting that was smaller than the penthouse he'd originally planned, but felt more like home. We talked about his mother and his stepfather, about my lonely apartment and my arthritis, and my dreams of maybe retiring somewhere warm someday. It was almost 4 a.m. when we finally headed back to my place, both of us exhausted, but somehow lighter than we'd been when the evening started. As I pulled into my parking space, Michael turned to me. "Can I ask you something? Anything." That night when I got into your car, when I was talking about you like you were nothing, like you didn't matter. Why didn't you tell me who you were right then? You could have humiliated me, could have made me feel as small as I was making you feel. I thought about that question, about all the anger and hurt I'd felt listening to him dismiss me as a failure and a disappointment. Because humiliating you wouldn't have fixed anything. It would have just been revenge, and revenge doesn't heal relationships. But you could have. You would have been justified. Maybe, but I didn't want to be justified. I wanted to be your father again. He smiled at that, the first genuinely happy smile I'd seen from him since he was 15 years old. Well, congratulations. I think it's working. As I watched him walk to his car, he'd driven separately to meet me after our therapy session, I realized that Dr. Martinez had been right about something she'd said in our first meeting. Healing doesn't happen on a schedule, and relationships can't be rebuilt just because a legal document requires it. But sometimes, if you're willing to sit in uncomfortable silence and listen to other people's stories and remember what it feels like to show up, even when it's hard, sometimes broken things can be made whole again. Sometimes accidents that seem like bad luck turn out to be exactly what you needed, even when you didn't know you needed it. And sometimes $33 million is just the excuse life gives you to do the work you should have been doing all along. Week 4 of our 30-day reconciliation period arrived with an unexpected crisis that had nothing to do with therapy sessions or carefully scheduled father-son activities. Michael called me at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, his voice tight with panic. Dad, I need help, real help, not inheritance-related help. The word dad still caught me off guard every time he said it, but the urgency in his voice snapped me fully awake. What's wrong? It's my roommate, Jake. He overdosed last night. He's alive. He's in the hospital, but the police found drugs in our apartment when the paramedics called them. They're saying I might be charged as an accessory because it's my lease, my name on everything. I was already reaching for my clothes, the phone pressed between my ear and shoulder. Where are you now? County jail. They let me make one phone call, and I called you. 4 weeks ago, if Michael had been in trouble, he would have called his mother or his stepfather or expensive lawyers who could make problems disappear with the right connections and enough money. The fact that he'd called me first, that in his moment of crisis he'd reached out to his father, meant more than any amount of progress we'd made in therapy. I'm on my way. Don't say anything to anyone until I get there. Dad, I can't afford a lawyer, not a good one. I spent most of my savings on deposits for apartments I thought I'd be able to afford once the inheritance came through. We'll figure it out, just hang tight. I spent the drive to the county jail making phone calls to every contact I'd built up over 40 years of construction work. Danny Kowalski, whose foundation work I'd done for free when his business was starting out, was now one of the best defense attorneys in the city. Maria Santos, whose kitchen I'd remodeled for cost when her husband was laid off, had a son who worked as a bail bondsman. In construction, you learn that relationships matter more than money, and sometimes those relationships pay dividends in ways you never expected. By noon, I'd called in enough favors to get Michael released on his own recognizance and connected with a lawyer who specialized in drug-related cases. By evening, we'd learned that the charges were likely to be dropped. The drugs belonged to Jake, who'd admitted as much once he was conscious and coherent, and Michael had never been more than a naive roommate who'd ignored the warning signs of his friend's addiction. But the experience had shaken him badly, and as we sat in my apartment that night, his first time seeing where I actually lived, I could see him processing the reality of how quickly life could change, how rapidly the safety net he'd always taken for granted could disappear. I keep thinking about what would have happened if this had occurred 5 weeks ago, he said, looking around my small living room with its secondhand furniture and stack of unpaid bills on the coffee table. I would have been completely alone. Mom and Richard would have hired a lawyer, sure, but they also would have been disappointed and ashamed. They would have handled it like a problem to be managed, not like someone they loved was in trouble. What makes you think I'm not disappointed? I asked. Because you didn't ask me if I was guilty. You didn't ask me if I was using drugs or if I knew Jake was dealing. You just asked what I needed and then showed up to help. I thought about that, about the difference between managing a problem and supporting a person. Michael, I've made enough mistakes in my life to know that good people sometimes find themselves in bad situations. I've also learned that when someone you love is in trouble, your job isn't to judge them. Your job is to help them find their way out. Is that what you did when Mom and I left? When I told you I hated you and never wanted to see you again? Did you just try to help me find my way? The question was harder than I'd expected, cutting straight to the heart of the guilt I'd been carrying for 13 years. I tried. Maybe not in the right way, maybe not in ways you could see or appreciate at the time, but I tried to give you space to grow up and figure out who you wanted to be without making you choose between me and the life your mother could provide. Even though it meant losing me? Even though it meant losing you. He was quiet for a long time, absently petting the old cat I'd adopted from the shelter last year. Smokey was a senior cat, probably abandoned when he got too old and expensive to maintain, and we'd found comfort in each other's company during the long evenings when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear alone. I've been thinking about Jake, Michael said finally, about how I lived with him for 8 months and never really saw what was happening. He was getting thinner, staying out all night, bringing strange people to the apartment, and I was so focused on my own life, my own plans, that I didn't pay attention to someone who was obviously struggling. Addiction is complicated, Michael. It's not your fault that... No, I know that. But it makes me wonder how many other things I've missed, how many people I've dismissed or ignored because I was too wrapped up in my own world to see theirs. I could see where this was going, could see him making connections that went beyond just his roommate's overdose. Michael, you were struggling too, weren't you? After the divorce, after I stopped talking to you, you were probably lonely and hurt and trying to figure out how to rebuild your life. And I was so angry about the way things had ended that I never once considered what it might be like for you. The honesty in his voice was almost painful to hear. You were a kid dealing with your parents' divorce. It wasn't your job to take care of my feelings. But I'm not a kid anymore. I haven't been a kid for over a decade, and I still never reached out. I never asked how you were doing or if you needed anything. I just assumed you were fine, or if you weren't fine, that you deserved whatever problems you had. And now I'm realizing that empathy isn't just about feeling sorry for people when bad things happen to them. It's about seeing them as complete human beings with their own struggles and pain and hopes, even when, especially when, they're the people closest to you. That night, Michael stayed on my couch rather than going back to his apartment, which was still partially sealed off as a crime scene. I woke up around 2 a.m. to find him sitting at my kitchen table, reading through a stack of letters I'd written to him over the years but never sent. "You kept these," he said without looking up. "I kept everything. Birthday cards I bought but never mailed, Christmas presents that sat in my closet until they were too small or too outdated to give. I kept thinking that someday I'd have the courage to reach out, or that someday you'd be ready to hear from me. This one is from my college graduation." He held up a letter dated 4 years ago. "How did you even know when I graduated?" "Your mother sent me the announcement. She thought I should know, even if I wasn't invited to the ceremony." He read the letter silently, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "You wrote that you were proud of me, that you hoped I was happy and successful, in that even though you couldn't be there, you were thinking about me." I am. "I was so angry that day, so angry that you weren't there, so convinced that you didn't care about any of the important moments in my life. I never imagined that you were sitting somewhere thinking about me, wishing you could be part of it." "I was at a sports bar about 6 blocks from your campus," I said quietly. "I couldn't go to the ceremony, but I wanted to be close by. I had a beer and watched a baseball game and thought about how proud your mother must be, how proud I was, how much I wished things were different between us." "You were 6 blocks away?" 6 blocks away, drinking a beer and trying not to cry in public because my son was graduating from college and I was going to miss it. He put down the letter and looked at me across the small table. "I don't want to miss any more important moments," he said, "yours or mine." I don't want to be the kind of person who lives 6 blocks away from the people he loves because he's too stubborn or too scared to close the distance. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want this to work, not just the 30-day reconciliation requirement, not just the inheritance. I want us to be father and son again, for real. I want to know what's happening in your life, and I want you to know what's happening in mine. I want us to show up for each other's important moments, even if they're just Tuesday nights when someone needs help or company or someone to sit with them in an empty apartment. I reached across the table and put my hand over his, feeling the calluses he'd never had as a child, evidence of work and experience, and a life I'd missed watching him build. "I want that too," I said. "More than the money, more than proving anything to your grandfather's lawyers, more than being right about any of the things we fought about over the years. I just want my son back." "You've got him," Michael said. "You've had him for longer than either of us realized. I just needed to stop being angry long enough to see it." We sat there in my kitchen until sunrise, talking about Jake's recovery and Michael's job, and my plans for maybe selling the car and finding something less physically demanding than driving 12 hours a day. We talked about the inheritance and what we'd do with the money if we successfully completed the reconciliation requirements, but more importantly, we talked about what we'd do regardless of the money. "I want you to meet my girlfriend," Michael said, as we watched the sun come up through my kitchen window. "Sarah. We've been dating for 6 months, and it's getting serious. I've been putting off introducing her to family because I wasn't sure I had any family to introduce her to. I'd like that. And I want to help you find a better apartment." Not because I'm embarrassed by this one, but because you deserve to live somewhere with better heating and windows that actually close properly. Michael, you don't need to. I want to. Even if there was no inheritance, even if we were both broke, I'd want to help however I could. That's what family does, right? They show up for each other. Outside, the city was waking up. Early commuters heading to work, delivery trucks making their rounds, the endless cycle of people going about their lives and carrying their own stories of love and loss and hope. In 12 hours, I'd be back out there driving some of them, listening to their conversations and their problems and their small victories. But for the first time in 3 years, I'd be going back to work as someone who had more than just a job and a paycheck waiting for him. I'd be going back as someone who had a family again, someone who belonged to something bigger than just his own survival. The inheritance was still 3 days away from being finalized, assuming Dr. Martinez signed off on our progress and the lawyers were satisfied that we'd met all the requirements. But sitting in my kitchen with my son, watching him read letters I'd written but never sent, I realized that we'd already inherited the most valuable thing my father had left us. We'd inherited each other. The final meeting with the lawyers was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m., exactly 30 days after I'd left that voicemail asking Michael to meet me at Mel's Diner. Dr. Martinez had submitted her report the day before, confirming that we'd not only met the minimum requirements for reconciliation, but had demonstrated what she called genuine commitment to rebuilding their relationship beyond the legal obligations. I'd taken the day off from driving, the first Friday in 3 years I hadn't worked, and Michael had called in sick to his marketing job. We met for breakfast at Mel's, not because we had to, but because it had become our place, the spot where we'd started this journey back to each other. "Nervous?" he asked as we waited for our coffee. "Terrified," I admitted. "Not about the money, but about what happens after today. The lawyers sign the papers, the money gets distributed, and then we have to figure out how to be father and son without a legal document telling us how to do it." "I've been thinking about that too." He pulled out his phone and showed me a text conversation with his girlfriend, Sarah. "I told her I wanted her to meet you this weekend. She's excited, but she's also nervous because she says this is the first time I've ever introduced her to family who actually matters to me." "I matter to you?" "You matter to me, more than I knew how to say before we started this process." Dolores appeared with our coffee and the pancakes we'd started ordering every time we came here. "You boys are looking happier these days," she said, smiling as she set down our plates. "Whatever you've been working on, it's good to see." After she left, Michael leaned back in the booth and studied me with an expression I was still learning to read. "Can I ask you something that's been bothering me?" "Anything." "When you picked me up that night, when I was talking about how much money I was going to have and how I didn't need family or anyone else, did you think about just letting me find out the hard way? About letting me show up to claim an inheritance that didn't exist, just so I'd learn a lesson about counting chickens before they hatched?" The question caught me off guard, partly because I had considered exactly that scenario in the days after our encounter. For about 5 minutes, yeah. I thought about how satisfying it would be to watch you realize that your assumptions about the inheritance were wrong, that you'd been planning a life based on incomplete information. What changed your mind? I realized that revenge fantasies are just another way of staying angry, and I was tired of being angry. I was tired of carrying around 13 years of hurt and resentment and what-if scenarios. I wanted to see if there was anything left of the relationship we used to have, and the only way to find out was to give us both a real chance to rebuild it, even though I didn't deserve a chance. Everyone deserves a chance, Michael. Maybe not a second chance or a third chance, but everyone deserves one honest opportunity to show who they really are when they're not hiding behind anger or fear or pride. He was quiet for a moment, cutting his pancakes into small pieces the way he'd done when he was 8 years old. I keep thinking about something Sarah said when I told her about all this. She said that the hardest part about rebuilding relationships isn't learning to trust the other person again. It's learning to trust yourself to be different than you were before.